We as the Van Abbe chose the term self-determination. So I understand subjectivization to be the formation of a subject in relation to another. In this sense, it is subjectivity in becoming, defined by what Felix Guattari saw as its polyphonic nature, open to and formed by many different inputs and influences, whether they be psychological, institutional, political, or economic. Within this, and imbuing the notion of subjectivization with a sense of political agency, I propose the term self-determination. Politically, self-determination speaks to the formation of a collective subjectivity outside the confines of dominant frameworks, whether that is the nation-state or broader institutional structures. More specifically, self-determination describes a political, intellectual, and an emotional process whereby a space is created for a collective identity to be formed, thus allowing agency to be taken. The question of self-determination complicates accepted binaries of nationalism and internationalism, demanding that political subjects define their position and project their future in relation to a wider set of contexts and parameters. It means refusing the dominance of external forces, whether they are systems of governance or the market, actively engaging authority and power. It has underpinned colonial struggles as well as current debates for countries to break away from imperial masters, forging a new path for and awareness of themselves. Equally, it runs through present political demands across the globe as new collective subjectivities form as they articulate their grievances and desires. The appeal of self-determination is that it goes beyond resistance to propose new definitions and social or political formations as yet unrealized or unforeseen. Culturally, self-determination opens up an important space for how artists, practitioners, and institutions define who they are, on what terms they operate, and in relation to whom. Here it seems to reignite the political potential of autonomy, a term that has ceded so much of its political bite to the modernist cause. It opens up the space for cultural agents to shape and articulate a collective identity and ideological framework within which to position themselves. Likewise, as institutions must reconsider their public role, as states drastically redefine their relationship to museums and cultural organizations, the need for self-determination seems prescient. Yet here we must speak of self-determination in relation to subjectivity, not for art to be self-determining, but artists, not museums, but those who work in them. Self-determination, wherever it appears, should thrive off its subjective impulses. So yeah, there we go. And here what I've put together is a series of images relating to some artworks or ideas that we've been looking at within the museum. This here is the Yikala bark petitions. It was something that I included in the exhibition I worked on, the Museum of Art Utile. These are bark petitions that were produced in Australia in the 1960s by the people of Yongalu, Aboriginal people, and they were submitted to the Australian government and became the first formal recognition of the Aboriginals and their right to the land. So their land was, contracts for their land was being given out to private companies for mineral mining, and these petitions were presented on bark in sort of traditional Aboriginal paintings to the Australian government. This then resulted in a whole many multiple years of legal discussions around land rights of the Aboriginal people, and in the mid-1970s the first sort of legal frameworks for rights of Aboriginal people were formed, but this was the sort of the first moment where that discussion began. And so, yeah, for me, this idea of self-determination, of forming a collective identity is kind of situated within these images. And I'll just move on. And then NSK, I brought up, which, yeah, perhaps doesn't need so much extrapolation after Zdenka's presentation. But here again, I think in terms of thinking ideas, thinking through self-determination as a kind of to work outside frameworks of nationalism internationalism, the nation state. NSK for me would be a very interesting example to look at. Okay, so this is a building called the Karat in Eindhoven, which was built in the 1970s as a kind of architectural experiment. So it was a huge open space that included schools, doctors, library, so conceived as really an architectural experiment for how different functions, different communities could come and live and work together. So you had no walls. I mean, this was the primary function. So you would have the waiting room for the doctors would be the bar. And next to it would be the schools, which would have no walls. So you could wait for your children after school whilst having a drink and your partner waiting to go to the doctor. What quickly happened over some years is that this system of living and working with one another became complicated. Walls were erected and the space got redefined. What you see at the bottom is a image of a video in a current exhibition at the Van Abbe by the Dutch artist Wendelin van Oldenburg, where she does a series of 3 films looking at the history of this building through the people who lived there. And she constructs the film around a series of day screenings with no preconceived script, and then sort of positions, re-edits the film around that and around 3 chapters. So again, I think in terms of thinking through how one's position in relation to those around you, how one defines the terms upon which one operates, this kind of phenomenon with Eindhoven is was quite interesting to me to think about. This is a work from our collection, Bust of a Lady by Picasso, and this was used for a project where I guess we became directly engaged with the idea of self-determination when we took this painting to Ramallah in Palestine for the project Picasso in Palestine. And so here I think in terms of how the museum itself can engage in these questions from Western Europe, to take this work to Ramallah, to a stateless state, which itself is grappling every day with these questions of self-determination, but one way in which the museum came sort of face-to-face with these questions. So I thought that could be an interesting example to talk about. So that's what I put together.